Hi, welcome to a new episode of History in 7 Facts, the show that aims to explore some interesting episodes of humanity's past. Check out this playlist to watch the entire series, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. To this day, the Crusades have a positive connotation attached to them. For us, the Crusaders were noble fighters who fought to defend their faith. But the reality is much more gruesome, and the Crusades were in fact an explosion of religious fanaticism and genocide. On July 15, 1099, after a month-long siege, the Crusaders of the First Crusade entered Jerusalem. The Muslim governor of the city surrendered, and he and his troops were allowed to leave Jerusalem. Then, all hell broke loose. The Crusaders massacred the local population, regardless of age, sex, and even faith. Even the local Christians were murdered because the Crusaders couldn't tell them apart from Muslims. The next day, they entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque and killed everyone, while the Jews burned in their synagogues. This is what the liberation of Jerusalem looked like. The survivors were tasked to gather the bodies from the streets. But the stench of death persisted for another 6 months. The Crusaders reported to have killed some 10,000 people, but a Muslim historian stated that 70,000 people were murdered. Today's historians estimate that somewhere around 40,000 people, most of them unarmed civilians, perished at the hands of the Crusaders. That's about 80% of the city's population. For all intents and purposes, this was a genocide. But 1,000 years had passed since then, and during these centuries, this event was portrayed as a heroic battle, and that's why even today, that's how we perceive them. No Christian of the time has condemned the Crusades. On the contrary, the sacking and conquering of Jerusalem was a glorious victory for the faith, even though the chronicles of the time did mention what happened there. Chronicler Raymond d'Aguilera wrote about the beheadings and the people burned alive. He wrote about severed limbs and heads in the streets of the city and how the men rode in the pools of blood. And he stated, "Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies." Raymond and the other Crusaders were absolutely convinced that they were carrying out God's will. Why? Because the Pope said so. 3 years prior to the Crusade, Pope Urban II spoke about the oppression of the Christian Church in the East. But the Pope's call to arms wasn't all about religion. It was more of a political decision. After all, Jerusalem was under Muslim control for over 4 centuries, but the Christians of the place were very rarely persecuted. In reality, the Pope responded to Emperor Alexius I's appeal for help. He was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, who was under great pressure in Anatolia due to the invading Turkish armies, and he was losing. So the Pope, as the representative of Christ on earth, called his followers to take back Jerusalem, and in return promised redemption for their sins plus a lot of loot. The Pope's speech worked. People from all areas responded to the call and swore to go to war. Thousands more pledged their allegiance after the church sent out preachers to spread the word. The idea caught on, and for many people, the promise of great riches was very appealing. In many areas of France and Belgium, the people were suffering from famine, so many were desperate to escape this misery. We don't actually know how many people started their long journey to Jerusalem, a journey that took 3 years, but when the army reached Constantinople, the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena wrote in her book, the Alexiad, that they outnumbered the sand on the seashore or the stars of heaven. Pope Urban decided that the armies would depart less than a year after the call to arms, in August 1096. But the thousands of poor peasants did not want to wait that long, so they started their own People's Crusade. This unauthorized campaign, which included tens of thousands of men, women and children, was led by a figure called Peter the Hermit, who claimed to have a letter from the heavens, in which God promised them that they would succeed if they only have the courage to try. But once they passed Constantinople, they were soon met by the Seljuk forces and were all but wiped out. Other groups that responded to Peter's call had no supplies whatsoever, so they started to attack and loot cities and villages in the Rhine Valley and Köln. Their primary target were the Jews, and the result was a huge massacre. Up to 12,000 Jews were murdered or driven to suicide by these crusaders. This represented about a third of the Jewish population in Germany and northern France, and it was one of the first pogroms in European history. These bands of looters were soon followed by organized armies led by powerful noblemen. They had the experience and the money to finance and lead the campaign. The Crusaders reached the Black Sea in 1097. Once they crossed the Bosphorus Strait, they encountered serious problems. They had to march in rough terrain, in enemy-controlled land, in the heat of the sun, with little food or water. They had to siege towns and confront enemy soldiers. But finally, in October that year, they reached the city of Antioch. Again, they had to siege the city. The walls built by the Byzantines before were hard to penetrate, but for some reason the Crusaders felt compelled to besiege it. During this siege, 1 in 7 Crusader would die of starvation and many deserted. When they finally entered Antioch, they themselves were sieged by a Muslim relief force. This was a moment of crisis, but faith helped them. On the 10th of June, an otherwise insignificant priest from southern France by the name of Peter Bartholomew came forward claiming to have had visions of Saint Andrew, who told him that the Holy Lance was inside the city. The Holy Lance was the lance that pierced the side of Jesus as he hung on the cross. The starving Crusaders were prone to visions and hallucinations, and another monk named Stephen of Valence reported visions of Christ and the Virgin Mary. On 14th of June, a meteor was seen landing in the enemy camp, interpreted as a good omen. People began to dig in the Cathedral of St. Peter on June 15th, and when they came up empty, Peter went into the pit and reached down and produced a spear point. The men took this as a divine sign that they would survive and thus prepared for a final fight rather than surrender. Peter then reported another vision in which Saint Andrew instructed the Crusader army to fast for 5 days, although they were already starving, after which they would be victorious. There is no question that this so-called discovery increased the morale of the Crusaders. And incredibly, they broke the siege and won the battle. After this, they finally reached Jerusalem. On their way, they again had to face starvation, heat, and enemy soldiers. 35,000 people died on their way to the Holy Land. Only 15,000 made it. It really seemed that they were at the mercy of God. They once again besieged the city. And once again, some people had visions. So while singing holy chants, the knights and soldiers marched around the city walls barefoot as a sign of repentance. After this, Peter the Hermit, yes, he was still alive, held religious sermons in the valley of Jehoshaphat, in the garden of Gethsemane, and on the Mount of Olives, sending the crusading knights lost into religious zeal. It was at this time that they were ready for a siege. The horrible massacre that would follow stemmed from this religious fanaticism and the incredible need for victory after 3 long and hard years. These people entered Jerusalem convinced that it was a miracle they had survived the journey. They killed and plundered, believing in the literal sense of their battle cry, Deus vult, God wills it. But there was nothing holy about this war. This was a massacre. Thank you for watching this episode of 7 Facts. I hope this was interesting and informative, and maybe it even inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked this video, please thumbs up and subscribe. While you're downstairs, let me know what you think about this video. Please consider visiting my Patreon page and become a patron. The link is in the description. I hope to see you next time. Bye.